The first vaccine for the coronavirus has been administered. Texas is now suing multiple states, and it's going straight to the Supreme Court. And the judge in the Michael Flynn case still is signaling that he will refuse to dismiss it, even after he was pardoned. All this and more on Breaking on the Daily. I'm Kel Kidman, and let's just get started with our first story, and that is the first COVID vaccine has now been administered to a grandmother of 90, who's 90 years old. Now this story, more than just the fact that this is the first COVID vaccine, I wanted to talk about something kind of more specific to this story, because the quotes from the person who got the first COVID vaccine are very interesting and telling about how this is all being reported. Because this 90-year-old said, "My advice to anyone offered the vaccine is to take it. If I can have it at 90, then you can have it too." Now, here's the problem with that statement. Yeah, vaccines are designed so that anyone could have them, and obviously someone who is 90, it is, I would say, necessary for them to have it because they're at an outsized risk to actually dying from the coronavirus if they get it. But to someone like me, someone who's 19, 20, around my age, who is relatively healthy, not obese, doesn't have any pre-existing conditions or anything like that, it's completely unnecessary for me to get the vaccine. In fact, if I were to get the vaccine particularly early, I would be simply preventing those who would actually need it from getting it. So, it's worth it to mention, this is someone from the UK, and in the US, the vaccine still hasn't been approved. It still hasn't. It's expected to be approved this week, but it's not yet been approved by the FDA, because apparently all the government bureaucracy, even during something that is ostensibly as important and as drastic and urgent as this pandemic, a global pandemic, they're still gonna laze around and sit on their hands for multiple weeks at a time, not doing anything of worth, wasting their time preventing a vaccine from actually getting through. That's what the FDA is doing right now. But to get back to my major point, this quote is interesting because I don't think this quote would have been reported if it didn't support the narrative that people are trying to gin up right now, and it didn't support the mainstream narrative that is trying to be ginned up right now. And if you've been paying attention at all to any sort of left-wing sites or any sort of left-leaning sites in the past year over this whole COVID pandemic, particularly once they started getting very, very extreme about it and tried to justify all these sorts of authoritarian measures, you'll notice that they have a lot of stories that are of personal anecdotes. Take this story from CNN as an example. A doctor, here's the headline. "A doctor who treated some of Houston's sickest COVID-19 patients has died." Now, this is a terrible story. It is an emotional story. It pulls at your heartstrings, and I have nothing but sympathy for the family who lost, their father, their husband, all of that. I'm very, very sympathetic to that. The thing is, this shouldn't be an actual story. This is front page news on CNN, or at least it was in the morning when I got up this morning. And it really shouldn't be. And they've been doing this sort of thing for months. And the reason they're doing this, and the reason they're showing all these anecdotes, rather than doing a real deep dive into the sort of analytics of it, the statistics, is because they want to push this narrative. Now, they don't explicitly push anything necessarily in this story, but what they do is they sow seeds of fear and doubt, and they try to push you into the mindset where you're more open towards having your freedoms be limited or outright violated by the government. That's what they're doing. That's their goal throughout all of these pieces. That's what they're doing. And to relate this back to the grandma story, they wouldn't have put this quote in. No one would have reported on this quote if it wasn't a way to push people to be more receptive to something like a vaccine requirement. Now, I'm not anti-vax, to be clear. I am very much pro-vaccine. I like people not getting diseases and that sort of thing. But I don't like requiring people to get vaccines, particularly when a vaccine's purpose is to prevent you from getting a disease. It is not to prevent someone else from getting a disease. You're not getting a vaccine to prevent someone else from getting a disease, at least not by and large. Why you're taking a vaccine is to be immune to the virus yourself. It is, at least broadly. Now, there is always, within these discussions, a sort of basic assumption that at some level, taking a vaccine will prevent spread. And to a certain extent, I can agree with that. But why would you get a vaccine if it doesn't make you immune to the disease? And so I don't see why that would be necessary, especially for something like this. I mean, every year there are flu vaccines. Not everyone gets it. I don't think I've ever had a flu vaccine. I might have had one when I was a child, but certainly not cognizantly. I've never cognizantly got a flu vaccine. Reason being, I don't need one. If I get the flu, oh no, I get the sniffles and I'm out of commission for a week or two. So what? That's been my feeling about coronavirus this entire time. If I get coronavirus, I don't particularly care. And yeah, you'll see all around people say, well, there's long-term effects, mind fog, all of these sorts of things. But the problem with that is those are very rare cases. And there has not been a whole lot of evidence that it's actually causational, where coronavirus is actually causing these problems, these heart problems, these mental problems. It's not actually been proven that there's a causational link. At least it has not been properly explained. And certainly, the studies on it are not very good, because a lot of them are... the few population studies that have been done on it, where they're trying to find out what percentage of people have these long-term effects, they weren't randomized, as far as I understand, at least the ones I've seen. They weren't randomized. They were essentially call-in, voluntary... they were voluntary participation. So essentially, people who had long-term diseases or long-term effects that they correlated to coronavirus were much more likely to actually take part in the study. It was a silly thing. It really is. It's just a silly thing. And you do have those sorts of effects rarely happen for other diseases as well. Things like flu, colds. It does happen in other diseases. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not a new aspect of COVID at all. But anyway, on to our next story. And this is an interesting one. China is launching an influence campaign on steroids targeting the Biden team and those around them, a top U.S. official says. This is completely to be expected. I mean, Beijing Biden is Beijing Biden. You would absolutely expect him to have these sorts of influence campaigns all over his campaign and all over these sorts of places. He's been funneling money out of China, millions, for years. I mean, we've had a confirmation that the Biden laptop from the Senate, by the way, not from any sort of outside area. This is as official as you could get for the establishmentarians out there. The Senate confirmed the Biden laptop story was legit, and the Bobulinski and all that sort of stuff. Biden has been in bed with China for years. He's been super soft on China pretty much his entire political career. You'd expect this to happen. Of course you would. I mean, anyone who is particularly surprised about this development is just a moron. or has at least not been paying attention anywhere near enough to actually understand what Biden is, how he operates. It's just extremely clear if you are surprised at all about this story. It's just such a silly thing. But on to our next headline story. Texas sues Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin at Supreme Court over election rules. Oh man, this is beautiful. And the fun thing about this is that since it's a lawsuit between states, it goes straight to the Supreme Court because it can't be done in any of the even federal courts. It has to go straight to the Supreme Court because it is a dispute between states. So this will be interesting to see where this goes. It follows very similarly based on the sort of tact I've been saying is what's likely going to get Trump the win if he does get the win. And that is the tact of these people were doing all these things wrong. The specific complaint for the Texas lawsuit here is about how these election laws, things like were propagated not through the legislature, as they are rightly done through the Constitution, but rather through the courts or through executive branches, and that is unconstitutional. And I think it's actually fairly likely that the Supreme Court will rule in this in Texas's favor. It's kind of a coin flip. You'll see what happens. I think Brett Kavanaugh's definitely the swing vote in this case, as opposed to the four other more hardline conservative justices on the court. We'll see where it goes. And it's interesting because the Pennsylvania lawsuit that I have been talking about for weeks is going to the Supreme Court very soon here, and we'll see whether the amicus brief gets actually accepted just a few days, presumably. And so this will be interesting. It'll be very interesting. It'll be very interesting to see where this goes. Because if this happens, if all of this sort of stuff happens, this affects hundreds of thousands of votes. These laws affect hundreds of thousands of votes, if not millions, after the Texas lawsuit. And I think this is a fairly poignant case, because I think this is going off of their successful legal strategy, and that is the Pennsylvania lawsuit, because it does look very similar to it in a lot of ways. So this will be interesting to see where it goes. This is just breaking news. Not a lot is known at this point, other than, the initial filing. We do have the initial filing, but we don't know where it's going to go, obviously. So we're going to have to wait a bit on that sort of update, but it will be coming, and I will be reporting on it once it comes out. So we'll just have to go on to our next story in lieu of new information in that case. Now, a White House advisor allegedly violated the Hatch Act, according to a watchdog, and this is according to a special counsel, the Office of Special Counsel, helmed by President Donald Trump appointee Henry Kerner. Now, the Hatch Act is interesting because it says that officials, government officials, cannot act politically in their official capacity. Now, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, because as you all know, or as anyone who's been watching my videos for a long period of time has known, I have a particular definition of politics, and I think the idea that we should remove politics from governmental auspices is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, because it's literally impossible. Because what is the definition of politics? The definition of politics is of the public. That is the traditional definition. That is its definition linguistically. In its root is polis, which means public, and politics means of the public. So a government official, literally a public worker, working without politics, is literally impossible. It is literally impossible. It's such a dumb thing. You cannot create a dumber law than this. I think this tops it. And there are a lot of dumb laws on the books currently. There are a lot of dumb laws. But I think this takes the cake of one of the dumbest laws I could possibly imagine. How exactly do you expect people who are creating public policy, who are affecting public policy, to not act in political ways, when politics is simply the act of doing things on a public level? Now, of course, this isn't the definition which is broadly used by a lot of the public. Rather, the broad use of the term in the public discourse is politics is the arguments between political parties, or the political process through which things are done on an elected level. But that's dumb. That's a dumb definition. It doesn't mean anything, really. We have this idea that politics is the issues of the day. It isn't. It is all public policy. Because all public policy could theoretically be the issue of the day. Why exactly is something like the income tax not a public policy issue? Why is it not politics to enact to enact the income tax? It is because it affects the public, and it is of the public, it is of the government. But under this definition, it isn't, because there's no argument around it. But that's dumb. Why is whether something is politics or not, it only determined by whether there's an argument about it. And even that doesn't really work, because then everything is politics, because everything has an argument surrounding it. Everything in public policy has an argument surrounding it, whether it's mainstreamed or not. Is completely irrelevant at that point. It's just so stupid. It's completely unenforceable, of course. There's no way this goes anywhere. And he talks, you have some quotes from people who say, well, the President Trump's administration regularly ignores the Hatch Act. And it's like, of course he does. Every administration does, because every administration affects public policy, which means they affect politics. It's just so dumb. You see why it's important to have precise language and not allow people to redefine things to mean whatever they want? Because this is what happens when you let them redefine any term they want into whatever they want. Because then they can make random things not politics. They can say, wow, it's so stupid that, climate policy is political. Of course it's political. It's of the public. It's about public policy. It's about government. Of course it's political. That is the nature of it. But they use this as an idea, as a way to completely stifle debate. Of course they do. That's their entire goal, after all. Their entire goal is to prevent all political debates. All debates on public policy is irrelevant in their eyes, or completely invalid in their eyes, because they know what is right. They know exactly how to run everything, because they're a bunch of authoritarians. That's the only person who could think that is an authoritarian. But of course, these people will claim, "Oh, we're anti-fascist. We're fighting against the people who believe that everything should be within the state." Nothing without the state, all within the state, that sort of thing. It's completely ridiculous, because they believe that. They just aren't nationalists; they're internationalists. But I hardly see the difference if your definition of fascism is so broad. It's just such a silly thing. Yeah. But on to our last story, and our last headline story. The Michael Flynn judge, has granted a long list of briefs signaling quick dismissal not happening after Trump pardon. Now, remember, this is the same guy who refused to dismiss the case after there was no prosecution, and brought in random people who had nothing to do with the case, and who had no standing to actually prosecute the case. He had them come in and essentially try to prosecute the case. This guy should be impeached. How hasn't he been impeached already? I think this guy is a federal judge. I'm pretty sure that we could at least bring up the idea of impeaching him. How? This guy is completely ridiculous. He's getting more and more ridiculous by the day, because now the prosecution is completely irrelevant, because he's been pardoned for it. It's mentioned that he might go after, it's too broad, whatever. But that's a completely separate issue, and probably shouldn't be done by this judge, who clearly has all of these sorts of conflicts of interest. I mean, it's clear this guy has a conflict of interest. He has a bone to pick with Michael Flynn. It's just so ridiculous. This has been a saga, by the way. And if you haven't been watching, Viva Frey talk about how this whole thing has been going down, you're really missing out, because this has been a roller coaster of just ridiculous legal decisions from this judge. And really, he deserves to be impeached. Though, it's worth it to mention my bias on this subject. I think a lot of judges should be impeached. I think half the freaking Supreme Court should be impeached. Which, by the way, if the Democrats ever decide to try and increase the court, that will be one of the greatest moments of all time. Not because of what immediately happens, because what immediately happens would be a bad thing, but because of what happens immediately after, what happens afterward. Because imagine 2022, you're going to have a 70-seat majority in the Senate, and that's probably a low ball. You're going to have ridiculous majorities in the Congress. You're going to be able to do whatever you want, all right? You're going to be able to impeach any justice and remove them, any of them that you want from the Supreme Court. You'd be able to reduce it to 5 and literally have where Gorsuch or something is the freaking swing vote. Seriously, that would be possible if they tried that. It would be political suicide. They'd completely destroy that party. And they completely destroy the court in the process, by the way. Which wouldn't be a particularly bad thing, considering what they've been doing over the past century. Century at this point. Almost century. It's ever since the 30s. Though, you could argue it goes back to the 1910s. It kind of. But I would say it really metastasizes in the 30s. But really, this guy, this judge, is completely ridiculous. He's offering, keep giving me more useless information that isn't going to prove anything. People who know nothing. Like, he brings in these people called Friends of the Court, who have nothing to do with the case. Nothing to do with the case. And it is essentially telling them, you act like prosecution. Prosecute this case for me. And he's essentially acting like the prosecution himself. It's completely ridiculous. He obviously needs to be impeached. This is one of the most blatant artifacts of judicial activism I've ever seen. And I've seen where the Supreme Court gives Oklahoma to freaking native tribes. It's even more ridiculous than that. Yeah, that's the end of that story, at least for now. This has been Breaking on the Daily. I'm Kel Kidman, and I'm out.